Austen Davies is going to speak to us. Austen does a tremendous job with his entertaining speeches, and I've no doubt that he's going to do so today. And give him a big round of applause.
Because as I've been sat here this morning and this afternoon, and Eddie's spoken, and Carl's spoken, and Simon's spoken, I've been ripping more and more of my speech up. So, with your indulgence, I'd like this afternoon to speak for a short while about my island. My island comprises a relatively small country with a relatively large population, for reasons that I shall expand upon in due course. A veritable jewel sat in an azure sea. It is separated from the nearby continent by a short, crucial strait of sea miles that has provided vital defences for millennia. My island has a proud history that goes back thousands of years, over which time many peoples have visited, made war, taken what they will, whilst others have stayed, colonising, cultivating the land and settling, to form part of what has evolved to be a disparate and resourceful island race, constituting a distinct indigenous peoples. Together with compatible minorities with whom these people happily interacted and coexisted, they lived in relative peace for many centuries. The indigenous people all talk the same language, more or less, albeit with such a rich regional variation that many an international visitor can still be left confounded to this day. In general, they're a godly people and serve and worship their God with diverse ritual relish. More than simply tolerated, that diversity of faith is regaled and celebrated. After 1,000 years of relative racial, ethnic and religious stability, whole areas of my island began to be colonised by an alien people who travelled in great numbers to enjoy the degree of prosperity they could never aspire to in their own land. They came initially at the behest of employers, with the help and encouragement of successive corrupt governments who could so readily be made to dance to the tune of cheap labour and pliable voting habits. But they continued to come even after the doors had been supposedly closed, by breaching those once so vital defences, that narrow channel separating my island from the continental mainland, and crossing the mere 18 miles of water that it comprises. And they did so in such numbers and with such frequency that inept and dysfunctional border controls were subjected to much derision and even accusations of corruption and collusion. The aliens brought with them a foreign religion, foreign dress, a foreign language, and a very foreign culture. All too often they remained a race apart, rarely integrating with the peoples they'd come to live amongst, and maintaining a distance from and a hostility towards their host peoples. And the people amongst whom they had come to live grew to rue the very day of that coming. But the new islanders prospered and multiplied, and their influence was seen to grow in the land. Many members of Parliament arose from amongst their number, and representation became divided along ethnic lines. Demands of beneficiary concessions were made and granted with a tedious regularity. Separate places of worship, exclusive faith schools, cultural heritage centres. The list was endless. Invariably, as their numbers increased, so did the pressure exerted on government, and in one supposedly final concession, the language of their homeland was granted official national status. Henceforth, everything from road signs to parliamentary drafts to food labelling must be produced bilingually. But it wasn't enough. Nothing was ever enough. Whole districts gradually became no-go areas so far as the indigenous peoples were concerned. As the aliens moved in, everyone who could moved out, leaving only the poor, the old, the infirm, and the vulnerable to remain in miserable isolation in the hostile environment they once loved and were once proud to call home. The cities especially became divided territories, with conflicting communities leading parallel existences and rarely crossing between. Amongst the invaders' hordes, however, were counted myriad traders and shopkeepers who showed themselves adept at maintaining and developing a sub-economy by selling to anyone but only ever buying from within their own community. By doing so, they ensured that more and more of the country's wealth became locked into that community. Thus, the new cats got fatter, and the others were despised as being no better than dogs anyway, so they didn't really matter. Then came the day. The morning sun arose on that day as it had done countless times before, but on that day a critical inflection point was reached. Change had manifested itself in a manner so profound, so intense, as to shake the foundations of nationhood and challenge the very order of civilization. And my venerable island looked into the abyss and saw therein the end of an epoch and the blood of a generation. The region to the north of the country had become so predominantly ethnic, the aliens had been permitted to run it along their own lines, along lines of custom and tradition embedded in the semi-arid wastelands from whence they had come. They paid minimal lip service to the law proper, and a nervous and dithery administration stood by as boundaries of acceptability were stretched to breaking point and beyond. The alien, the malcontent, the usurper had, to all intents and purposes, established an unofficial independent sub-state. That night in the north of the country, a police station was attacked by a meticulously orchestrated and brutal mob. 13 police officers were hacked to death and the building set ablaze and destroyed. The fire and ambulance services responded to desperate pleas for help, but the operatives were forced to flee for their lives on foot as their vehicles were corralled, rammed by hijacked buses, and finally torched. It had begun. The ensuing chain of events unfolded with a bewildering speed. The aliens, now organised and motivated as never before, were minded to take over. The country was petitioned by the alien, and the northern and eastern sectors put on a military footing and blockaded by them. 100,000 non-ethnics were given 24 hours' notice to get out or face the consequences, and dire they were. And they left in a train of misery and desolation as the new islanders mocked them and spat on them, even as they were loading the carts and trucks with what possessions they could carry, because their money and property was forfeit, naturally. At this juncture, I am able to reveal some good news and some bad news. The good news is that I've not been speaking about Britain or England. The bad news is that history has a nasty habit of replicating itself if we allow it to. My other island is Sri Lanka, where I've spent many, many happy months, running into years. On the map it sits as a teardrop running just to the bottom right of India, 18 miles away, across the Palk Straits at their narrowest point. The invading aliens are the Tamils from the South Indian state of Tamil Nadu. Tamils were shipped across from the mainland in droves to work the Sri Lankan tea plantations for the Brits, who displayed a blissful contempt for the law of unintended consequences. Now, clearly you, being good, decent and trusting folk, will have watched the BBC, Channel 4 and even David Cameron portraying the Tamil as a persecuted, downtrodden minority. One side of the rupee only being offered for consumption, I'm afraid. The indigenous peoples of Sri Lanka are indeed people of faith. They are in the main Buddhist, Christian and Muslim. Yet other than on feast days and holy days, they are indiscernible one from another. They are the Sinhalese people, the lion people, shaped over thousands of years from Asian, Middle Eastern and European settlers. They make for a fascinating parallel with the Brythonic, Anglo-Saxon and Nordic peoples that formed the Britons. Sri Lanka is geographically small, half the size of England, but it's rich and fertile with a wealth of resources that make it an attractive option to those who dwell in the arid lands across the sea, and it was its attractiveness that nearly marked its downfall. The Tamil riots had been masterminded by one Velupillai Prabhakaran, a rabid Marxist revolutionary, separatist and avid student of war and terrorism. Prabhakaran studied to the point of obsession the military achievements of Alexander the Great, Napoleon, and in particular a certain diminutive Austrian gent. Prabhakaran founded the Tamil Tigers, or more correctly the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. Eelam because it's the ancient Tamil name for Sri Lanka, and tigers because tigers are incompatible with lions. Tigers war with lions. Mr. Prabhakaran, that's a mouthful, isn't it? Mr. Prabhakaran was an innovative sort of fellow. He was to introduce to the modern theatre such niceties as suicide bombers, human shields, and child soldiers. Children as young as 5 were kidnapped and indoctrinated, that is to say, schooled in hate and extremism. He also developed some imaginative methods of torture with the aid of red ants, chili powder, and 1 or 2 other choice items. The insurgency inspired and led by Prabhakaran is referred to as a civil war, but in reality it was an indigenous struggle with the terrorists within. Prabhakaran wanted a whole section of the country to rule over, but that in itself was not enough. Nothing, you may remember, is ever enough. Prabhakaran wasn't choosy about who got killed or crippled along his way. The attack on a military convoy, think Warren Point, soon after the insurgency began, took no account of the fact that a goodly number of the soldiers blown to bits that day were from his own people. Likewise, Alfred Durapaya, the Tamil MP, who was mayor of Jaffna in 1975, one of his own people, murdered by Prabhakaran at his own hand for failing to do exactly as he was told. The government finally recognised that they might have a bit of a problem and moved against the Tamil paramilitaries. But as the army tended to play by the rules and adversaries never did, their rules had something of a disadvantage. The self-styled Tigers shred their battle fatigues at the first hint of force majeure and blended in with ordinary villagers and townfolk, a tactic they were to deploy regularly right to the end of the conflict. And they yelped for help from India whenever the tide turned against them. Despite the Tamil Tigers being an illegal terrorist organisation, and despite Prabhakaran being wanted by Interpol for murder, terrorism, organised crime, conspiracy, whenever government forces were in danger of getting the upper hand, the international community and the Indian authorities in particular leapt to the defence of the oppressed minority. Prabhakaran's foul murdering regime endured for nearly 30 years, and despotic murders were followed by terrorist outrages, were followed by despotic murders. An initiative of obscene irony saw Prabhakaran's operatives recruit suicide bombers from amongst the Buddhist communities. Poor, simple village folk, believing in reincarnation, imagined themselves returning as somebody's pampered pet, whilst the blood money their widows and orphans received would at least feed them and put the kids through school. One Indian politician, an inspiring young man, destined for the top, dispatched Indian troops to the island to act as peacekeepers, an Indian solution for an Indian problem. But it didn't suit Prabhakaran one little bit. Nobody called shots on his manor. The inspiring young man was Rajiv Gandhi. He was murdered by Prabhakaran's brainwashed psychopaths in 1991. And I could spend the rest of this afternoon detailing the horrors, the inhuman behaviour, the crimes against humanity that ensued. The suicide bombing of Sri Lanka's central bank in the capital Colombo, 91 civilians, fathers, sisters, sons, daughters slaughtered. 1,400 people, 1,400 people, one incident, depended upon for putting food on their families' tables, maimed and disabled. More than 100 blinded, condemned to a life of begging for scraps on the benefit-free streets. And it almost was enough. A new nationalist coalition government was swept to power by an angry and sickened electorate. A government committed to end it, whatever the cost and whatever the consequences. And so they set forth. India squealed, the West squawked, and blood beast Prabhakaran hid in his forest lair and sent old men and children out to face the by now well-trained, well-prepared and very well-equipped government forces. The Sri Lankan armed forces moved relentlessly and mercilessly forward, despite the rising tide at their rear, the murmur of voices that grew to crowds of outrage and international condemnation. Negotiate now, they demanded. The President, Rajapaksa, didn't even bother to argue. The time for negotiation was long past. As the Tamil Tigers were driven quite literally into the sea, Prabhakaran tried to save himself. He didn't give a damn for the 30,000 of his people who fell during those final days. He had his luggage packed in the 12 million rupees, a vast, vast fortune he'd pocketed from party funds would surely buy him safe passage. He threw up his hands in surrender and was shot like a dog. The mood of the island changed overnight. The new day that dawned was lighter, brighter somehow than it had been in a quarter of a century. And it still is today, 4 years on. Tamils in exile, the diaspora, still wage war, but a propaganda war now, a war of cunning and manipulation. There are large Tamil populations in the UK, which I know will come as a surprise. Large Tamil populations in the US and in Canada, and they all have votes. And they all know all there is to know about pressure groups, hence the posturing and pontification of our puerile politicians with their cries of human rights and war crimes. Yet the people of all the Sri Lankan communities who are going about their daily business without being bombed, without seeing their wives gang raped in front of them, without having to watch as their children are dragged away to be re-chipped, feel that to do so has something to do with their human rights, rights that they enjoy and would rather like to retain. They believe there are no war crimes. War itself is the crime, and the criminals obtained their just deserts. Channel 4's coverage and the other slanted media condemnations would have us believe the entire population of Tamils on the island to have either fled, been slaughtered, or had their passports cancelled. Look it up yourself, please. The actuality is that 3 million ethnic Tamils were content to remain in their war-free, terrorist-free, mad-spotting, murdering, fascist dictator-free island that is the proudly nationalist, democratic, socialist Republic of Sri Lanka. But we are 4,000 miles away from there, here in Blackpool, and it's cold. What care we for that small island just a short strait of sea miles from the continent? What care we for that foolish people who welcomed a viper to their bosom and gave it succour? What care we for the blood of a foreign generation spilt on the altar of appeasement that was not enough, that was never, ever enough? Those who fail to learn the lessons of history are doomed to repeat them. And a hostile alien is amongst us now, and the historical parallels are frightening. Yet do we know him? He's not the immigrant. He's not the Eastern European. He's not the African. He's not the Asian. He's not even the Muslim. He's the malcontent, the usurper, the predator, the parasite. It is he who, never having truly left the squalor, depravity and degradation of his homeland, is now implanting its replica within the vital organs of the host. He has established his sub-state, but that will not be enough. He is the Islamist, and nothing will ever be enough. Know him, know his mark, know his black flag, or it will blot out our sun while we fight each other over which end to crack the egg open, and know not who is our friend. Tomorrow is the beginning of Advent, the coming of our Lord. It is the first day of the Christian year, and it is the first day of the rest of our lives. The first day of the future of our party and of our cause, the first day of the future for our children. We can look back at this day with loathing and regret, or we can say that was when it began. That was when we first reached out to our enemy's enemy and saw that, foul and twisted as he may appear, he is our friend and our path to victory. I leave you with King John, Crap King, great play. Now these, her princes, are coming home again. Come the three corners of the world in arms, and we shall shock them. Naught shall make us rue, if England to itself do rest but true. Thank you.